Bullies slapped the quiet girl in the library. Her next move stunned everyone. 17-year-old Serafina Blackwood sat alone at the furthest corner table in Westfield Academy's library, her slender frame hunched over a worn paperback novel. Her dark auburn hair fell like a curtain around her pale face, hiding the sharp intelligence that flickered behind wire-rimmed glasses. At barely 5 feet tall and weighing no more than 100 pounds, she looked fragile as porcelain. Most students at the prestigious boarding school barely noticed her existence. Just invisible enough to survive, she thought, turning another page without really reading the words. That's how I like it. Serafina had been at Westfield for 3 months now, transferred from her previous school after what the administrators delicately called an incident. Her parents, both diplomats frequently traveling for work, had chosen this elite institution for its reputation and distance from their home in Washington, D.C. What they didn't know was that their daughter carried secrets that would make their political careers crumble if exposed. The library's heavy oak doors creaked open, and Serafina's stomach tightened instinctively. 3 figures strutted in with the confidence that only came from wealth and social status. Madison Hartwell led the trio, her platinum blonde hair perfectly styled despite the late afternoon hour. At 18, she was everything Serafina wasn't: tall, athletic, beautiful, and cruel. Her father owned half the tech companies in Silicon Valley, giving her the kind of untouchable power that corrupted absolutely. Behind Madison stalked her lieutenants, Cassandra Vale, a redhead with a vicious smile and a trust fund the size of a small country's GDP, and Brooklyn Pierce, whose family's pharmaceutical empire had built Westfield's newest wing. They called themselves the Trinity, and they ruled the school with iron fists wrapped in designer gloves. "Don't look up," Serafina commanded herself. "Maybe they'll just pass by," but Madison's predatory instincts had already locked onto her target. She sauntered over, her expensive heels clicking against the marble floor like a countdown to execution. "Well, well," Madison's voice dripped with false sweetness, "if it isn't the scholarship girl, hiding in her little cave again." Serafina kept her eyes fixed on her book, though the words had become meaningless squiggles. She'd learned long ago that engagement only made things worse. "I'm talking to you, Mouse," Madison snapped, using the nickname that had somehow stuck despite Serafina's best efforts to remain anonymous. The other students in the library looked up briefly, then quickly returned to their studies. Nobody wanted to attract the Trinity's attention. Mrs. Pemberton, the elderly librarian, was nowhere to be seen, probably in her office grading papers with her headphones on, as usual. "Did you know," Cassandra chimed in, perching on the edge of Serafina's table, "that some people are saying you think you're better than everyone else? Just because you read all those dusty old books," Brooklyn added, flipping through Serafina's novel dismissively. "What is this garbage?" "The Art of War." "Seriously?" Serafina's jaw tightened slightly. Sun Tzu's ancient text wasn't garbage. It was one of the most brilliant military strategies ever written. But explaining that would only give them more ammunition. "You know what I think?" Madison leaned down, her perfectly manicured nails scraping against the wooden table. "I think little Mouse here needs to learn some manners, maybe some lessons in how to properly acknowledge her betters when they speak to her." "Breathe," Serafina told herself. "Count to 10. Remember why you can't fight back." The first incident had been small. Madison accidentally bumping into her in the hallway, sending her books flying. The second time, Cassandra had mistakenly dumped her lunch tray on Serafina's uniform. Each encounter escalated, but Serafina endured them all with the same stone-faced silence. She couldn't afford to lose control. Not again. The secret she carried was too dangerous, too explosive. 3 months ago, at her old school, she'd made the mistake of letting her true nature show. One moment of lost control had left 2 boys hospitalized and herself transferred to Westfield with a sealed record that would follow her forever. Her father wasn't just any diplomat, he was the director of clandestine operations for the CIA. Her mother headed the State Department's most classified division. From the age of 5, Serafina had been trained by the world's most elite operatives, hand-to-hand combat, weapons training, psychological warfare, interrogation techniques, all disguised as extracurricular activities that would help her stay safe in their dangerous world. By age 10, she could disarm a grown man with her bare hands. By 12, she'd mastered 17 different fighting styles. By 15, she'd already been on 3 covert operations disguised as family vacations. But with great power came the crushing weight of absolute secrecy. Her parents had made it clear, exposure meant not just the end of their careers, but potentially their lives. Too many people wanted to hurt those who knew America's deepest secrets. So Serafina Blackwood, one of the most dangerous teenagers in the country, played the role of invisible scholarship student. She let Madison and her cronies humiliate her daily, absorbing their cruelty like a sponge soaking up poison. I said, "Acknowledge me," Madison hissed, grabbing Serafina's chin and forcing her to look up. For just a moment, their eyes met. Madison saw something flicker in those dark depths, something that made her instinctively step back, but the moment passed so quickly she convinced herself she'd imagined it. "There's those pretty brown eyes," Madison cooed mockingly. "Now I want you to say, 'Good afternoon, Madison. Thank you for gracing me with your presence.'" The words stuck in Serafina's throat like broken glass. Around them, other students pretended to study while secretly watching the drama unfold. This was entertainment for them, watching the weak get devoured by the strong. "I don't have all day, Mouse," Madison snapped. "Say it." 37 different ways I could end this right now, Serafina thought, her muscles tensing despite her efforts to stay calm. Pressure point behind the ear, unconscious in 3 seconds, strike to the solar plexus, can't breathe for 5 minutes, grab the wrist, twist, shoulder dislocation, game over. Instead, she whispered, "Good afternoon, Madison. And thank you for gracing me with your presence." Madison's smile was triumphant and vicious. "See? That wasn't so hard. Now, since you're obviously not doing anything important, you can help us with our history project." She gestured to Brooklyn, who dumped a stack of books onto Serafina's table, knocking over her water bottle and soaking her notebook. "We need a report on World War II by tomorrow morning," Cassandra explained with fake sweetness. 5 pages, properly cited, all that boring stuff you're so good at. "Do our homework, Mouse," Madison commanded. "Maybe then we'll consider letting you eat lunch in peace tomorrow." They sauntered away, leaving Serafina staring at the soggy remains of her notes. Around her, conversations gradually resumed, but she could feel the weight of pitying glances and whispered comments. "Pathetic. Why doesn't she just fight back? I'd never let them treat me like that. If only they knew the truth. If only they understood that she was protecting them as much as herself by staying silent." The weeks passed in a blur of escalating humiliation. Madison seemed to take Serafina's compliance as permission to get more creative with her torments. She'd accidentally spilled coffee on Serafina's uniform right before important presentations. She'd spread rumors about Serafina's family being broke, about her stealing from other students, about her having some kind of contagious disease. The Trinity made Serafina's life a living hell, and she endured it all with the same silent dignity that was slowly eating her alive from the inside. "I'm not a victim," she reminded herself daily. "I'm undercover. This is just another mission." But it was getting harder to maintain that fiction, especially when the harassment moved beyond just words and pranks. It happened on a Tuesday afternoon in the gymnasium. Serafina had been excused from participating in volleyball due to a twisted ankle, actually a minor injury from her morning combat training session in the abandoned storage room she'd found in the school's basement. She sat on the bleachers, reading while pretending to watch the game. Madison's team was losing badly, which always put her in a particularly foul mood. When the ball rolled toward Serafina's feet, Madison stormed over to retrieve it. "Move it, mouse," she snapped. Serafina quickly shifted aside, but apparently not fast enough for Madison's liking. The blonde girl accidentally knocked Serafina's book from her hands, sending it tumbling down the bleachers. "Oops," Madison said with a smirk. "Better go fetch it." As Serafina climbed down to retrieve her book, she heard Madison whisper something to Brooklyn. Both girls giggled maliciously. When Serafina bent to pick up her book, Brooklyn's foot shot out, catching her behind the knee. Serafina tumbled forward, barely catching herself before face-planting on the gymnasium floor. The few students who noticed laughed, thinking she'd simply tripped over her own clumsiness. It would be so easy, Serafina thought as she slowly got to her feet, ignoring the burning pain in her scraped palms. Brooklyn's ankle is completely exposed. One quick twist, and she'd be on crutches for months, but she couldn't. She wouldn't. Instead, she retrieved her book and returned to the bleachers without a word. The breaking point came 3 weeks later, on a rainy Thursday afternoon that started like any other. Serafina had claimed her usual corner table in the library, working on an essay about diplomatic relations in Southeast Asia, a topic she probably knew more about than her professor, given her family's work in the region. The library was nearly empty due to a school assembly she'd managed to skip with a note from the nurse about a headache. Mrs. Pemberton was at the assembly too, leaving the library completely unattended. Madison, Cassandra, and Brooklyn burst through the doors like a storm front, clearly having skipped the assembly as well. But something was different about them today. Their usual casual cruelty had been replaced by something harder, more focused. Madison was furious about something. Her face was flushed, her jaw clenched, her hands balled into fists. She spotted Serafina immediately and began stalking toward her with purposeful intent. "You!" Madison snarled, pointing an accusatory finger. "This is all your fault." Serafina looked up, genuinely confused. "I'm sorry? Don't play innocent with me, you pathetic little worm." Madison slammed her hands down on the table, making Serafina jump. "I know what you did. What I did." Serafina's mind raced through possibilities. She'd been so careful to avoid any kind of confrontation or retaliation. What could Madison possibly be talking about? "Professor Hartwell called my father," Madison continued, her voice rising with each word. "Apparently someone submitted a report about cheating in his American history class. Someone provided detailed evidence about how certain students have been paying others to write their papers." Understanding dawned on Serafina's face. She hadn't reported Madison directly, but she had noticed the remarkable similarity between Madison's essay and one she'd seen posted on a homework-for-hire website. When Professor Hartwell had asked the class to report any suspected academic dishonesty, Serafina had quietly mentioned what she'd observed. She'd thought it would be handled discreetly. She'd thought her name would never come up. "My father is threatening to cut off my allowance," Madison hissed. "Do you have any idea what that means? I might have to get a job like some common peasant, and it's all because of you, you jealous little rat. I didn't. Don't lie to me." Madison's hand whipped out, connecting with Serafina's cheek in a sharp slap that echoed through the empty library. The silence that followed was deafening. Serafina sat frozen, her hand slowly rising to touch her stinging cheek. In all her months of enduring Madison's torments, the girl had never actually struck her before. There had been pushes, shoves, accidental collisions, but never direct violence. Something fundamental had just shifted. "Feel better now?" Serafina asked quietly, her voice steady despite the rage building in her chest like a nuclear reactor approaching critical mass. Madison blinked, apparently surprised by the calm response. Yes, I do feel better. Maybe if you got slapped around more often, you'd learn to keep your mouth shut." She turned to her friends with a triumphant grin. "See, I told you she wouldn't do anything. She's too pathetic to fight back. Cassandra laughed. Oh my God, Madison, look at her face. She looks like she's about to cry. But Brooklyn, who had the sharpest instincts of the three, noticed something else. Madison, she said uncertainly, maybe we should... Should what? Madison whirled around. She got what she deserved. If anything, she deserves worse. She turned back to Serafina, emboldened by what she perceived as complete victory. You know what? I'm not done with you yet. Stand up. Madison, seriously, let's just go, Brooklyn urged. But Madison ignored her. I said, stand up. Madison grabbed Serafina's arm and yanked her to her feet. That was her second mistake. The first had been the slap. The second was putting her hands on someone who had been trained since childhood to respond to physical aggression with overwhelming force. Every instinct Serafina had developed over years of training screamed at her to react. Madison's grip on her arm was clumsy, leaving her completely vulnerable to a dozen different takedown techniques. Her stance was all wrong, her balance compromised, her attention focused on intimidation rather than defense. She's an amateur, Serafina realized. She has no idea how to actually fight. Let go of me, Serafina said quietly. Or what? Madison tightened her grip, her manicured nails digging into Serafina's arm. You'll tell the teacher? You'll cry? What are you going to do, Mouse? The nickname that had followed Serafina for months suddenly felt different, not like a burden, but like a disguise that had finally served its purpose. I'm not a mouse, Serafina said, her voice still quiet, but carrying an undertone that made Brooklyn take an involuntary step backward. Madison heard it too, but her arrogance blinded her to its meaning. Oh, really? Then what are you? Serafina looked up, meeting Madison's eyes directly for the first time since the confrontation began. The girl, who had spent months hiding behind wire-rimmed glasses and hunched shoulders, was gone. In her place stood someone else entirely, someone whose dark eyes held depths that spoke of secrets and skills that Madison couldn't even imagine. I'm someone who's been very, very patient, Serafina said, but patience has its limits. Madison felt a chill run down her spine, but pride and anger wouldn't let her back down. You're pathetic, she snarled, raising her other hand as if to slap Serafina again. The hand never connected. In the movement so fast it was barely visible, Serafina caught Madison's wrist and twisted, not hard enough to break anything, but firmly enough to make the message clear. Madison gasped, suddenly finding herself off balance and completely at Serafina's mercy. Here's what's going to happen, Serafina said calmly, still holding Madison's wrist in a grip that was surprisingly strong for someone so small. You're going to let go of my arm. You're going to step back, and you're going to walk away. Like hell I am, Madison spat, trying to pull free. But Serafina's grip was immovable, and any attempt to struggle only made the pressure on her wrist more uncomfortable. Cassandra started forward to help her friend, but something in Serafina's expression made her freeze mid-step. I wouldn't, Serafina advised without looking away from Madison. This doesn't have to involve you. You're hurting me, Madison whimpered, finally beginning to understand that she was no longer in control of the situation. I'm barely touching you, Serafina replied truthfully. The hold she had on Madison's wrist was painful, but not damaging. A restraint technique designed to control without causing injury. If I wanted to hurt you, you'd already be on the floor. Something in her tone made it clear that this wasn't an idle threat. Madison's face went pale. Let me go. Are you going to walk away? Yes, Madison said quickly. Yes, I'll walk away. Serafina studied her face for a long moment, then released her grip. Madison immediately stumbled backward, cradling her wrist against her chest. Good, Serafina said, settling back into her chair as if nothing had happened. I'm glad we understand each other. But Madison's humiliation was too fresh, her pride too wounded. The rational part of her brain screamed warnings, but the part that had never been truly challenged before refused to accept defeat. "You think you're so tough?" Madison snarled, her face flushed with rage and embarrassment. "You think because you learned some karate moves, you can disrespect me?" Brooklyn grabbed her arm. "Madison, let's just go. Please." "No!" Madison shook her off violently. "I'm not letting this freak make me look weak in front of everyone." "There's no one else here," Cassandra pointed out nervously. "There will be," Madison said, her voice taking on a dangerous edge. "By tomorrow, everyone in school will know that Madison Hartwell got manhandled by the scholarship mouse. My reputation will be ruined." She began pacing like a caged animal, her expensive heels clicking erratically against the marble floor. "Unless I do something about it right now." Serafina watched this display with growing concern. She'd hoped the brief show of strength would be enough to end things, but Madison's reaction suggested otherwise. The girl was spiraling, her carefully constructed self-image crumbling in real time. "I should have just taken the slap," Serafina thought. "Should have maintained the cover, but it was too late for regrets now." Madison suddenly stopped pacing and turned to face Serafina with a look of cold determination. "You know what? Fine. You want to play tough? Let's play tough." Before anyone could react, she grabbed a heavy brass bookend from a nearby shelf and hefted it like a weapon. "Madison, no!" Brooklyn gasped. "Put that down," Serafina said, rising from her chair. Her voice remained calm, but every muscle in her body was now coiled for action. "Or what? You'll twist my wrist again?" Madison's laugh was harsh and unhinged. "I don't think so. I think it's time someone taught you a real lesson about respect." She raised the bookend above her head, clearly intending to bring it down on Serafina's skull. That was her final mistake. Serafina moved with the fluid grace of someone who had spent years mastering the art of controlled violence. She closed the distance between them in 2 quick steps, her left hand catching Madison's raised wrist, while her right struck the nerve cluster in Madison's elbow. Madison's entire arm went numb instantly, and the bookend clattered harmlessly to the floor. But Serafina wasn't done. Years of suppressed frustration, months of endured humiliation, and the fresh sting of that slap all combined into a moment of perfect, terrible clarity. Madison had crossed the line from verbal harassment to attempted assault with a deadly weapon. The gloves were off. Serafina spun Madison around and applied a blood choke, a technique that cut off circulation to the brain without damaging the windpipe. Madison had exactly seconds to contemplate her situation before unconsciousness claimed her. She dropped like a puppet with cut strings. Cassandra screamed. Brooklyn stood frozen, her mouth hanging open in shock. Serafina knelt beside Madison's unconscious form and checked her pulse, steady and strong. She'd be fine in a few minutes, though she'd wake up with a headache and a drastically altered perspective on who she could safely bully. Is she dead?" Cassandra whispered. "Of course not," Serafina replied calmly, rising to her feet. "She's unconscious. She'll wake up in about 5 minutes with nothing worse than a bruised ego." She looked at Madison's 2 remaining friends, who were staring at her like she'd just revealed herself to be an alien. "But I want to be very clear about something," Serafina continued, her voice carrying the kind of quiet authority that made both girls instinctively straighten their postures. "This ends now, today, forever." "We weren't," Brooklyn started. "Yes, you were," Serafina cut her off. "For 3 months, you've followed Madison around like loyal attack dogs, participating in every cruel game she invented. You think because you weren't the ringleader, you're innocent." Brooklyn's face flushed with shame. "I tried to warn her," she said weakly. "After months of helping her torment me," Serafina replied, "your last-minute attack of conscience doesn't erase your complicity." She walked over to her table and began packing her books with deliberate calm. "Here's what happens next. When Madison wakes up, you're going to help her understand that she picked the wrong target. You're going to make sure she knows that any future attempts at retaliation will not end as gently as this one did. Are you threatening us? Cassandra asked, trying to muster some of her old defiance. Serafina paused in her packing and looked at her directly. I'm offering you a chance to walk away from this with your dignity and tact. Madison chose to escalate things to physical violence. I responded appropriately. What happens next depends on the choices you make. She shouldered her bag and walked toward the library doors, then paused and turned back. Oh, and just so we're clear, she added, I didn't use karate. The doors swung shut behind her, leaving the two conscious girls staring at their unconscious ringleader and trying to process what had just happened. Madison woke up 7 minutes later with a splitting headache and no clear memory of how she'd ended up on the library floor. Brooklyn and Cassandra helped her to her feet, but neither of them seemed willing to explain exactly what had transpired. Where did she go? Madison asked groggily. Who? Brooklyn replied evasively. The mouse! Where did that pathetic little mouse go? Brooklyn and Cassandra exchanged glances. Finally, Cassandra spoke up. Madison, she said carefully, I don't think she's a mouse. The next morning, Serafina walked through Westfield Academy's hallways with her head held high for the first time in months. Students who had previously looked right through her now watched her with curious eyes, whispering among themselves. Word had spread quickly through the school's gossip network. The story had been embellished and exaggerated with each telling, but the core facts remained consistent. Quiet, harmless Serafina Blackwood had somehow put Madison Hartwell on the floor in the library. The Trinity was nowhere to be seen, which only added to the speculation. Serafina found her usual corner table in the library during lunch period, but she wasn't alone for long. Students began approaching her, tentatively at first, then with growing confidence. Hey, said a sophomore named David, whom she recognized from her chemistry class. Is it true you know martial arts? Serafina looked up from her book and smiled slightly. I know a few things. Could you teach me? Asked Jenny, a freshman who had been one of Madison's favorite targets before Serafina had arrived. I mean, if you're not too busy or anything. More students gathered around, all of them outcasts and underdogs who had suffered under the Trinity's reign of terror. They looked at Serafina with something she'd never seen before, hope. I could show you some basic self-defense, Serafina said carefully, but only if you promise to use it responsibly. They nodded eagerly, and Serafina felt something shift inside her chest. For the first time in months, she wasn't pretending to be someone else. She was still keeping her most dangerous secrets, but she was no longer hiding her fundamental strength. Madison didn't return to school for 3 days. When she finally did appear, she looked different, subdued, uncertain, constantly glancing over her shoulder. She gave Serafina a wide berth in the hallways, and when their eyes accidentally met across the cafeteria, Madison looked away first. The power dynamic had shifted permanently. Brooklyn approached Serafina on Friday afternoon when she was leaving her final class of the week. Can we talk? Brooklyn asked, her usual confidence replaced by nervous uncertainty. They walked outside to the school's courtyard, where ancient oak trees provided privacy from curious onlookers. I wanted to apologize, Brooklyn said without preamble, for everything. What we did to you was wrong, and I should have stopped it. Serafina studied her face, looking for signs of deception or manipulation. But Brooklyn's remorse seemed genuine. Why didn't you? Serafina asked. Brooklyn was quiet for a long moment. Because it was easier to be on Madison's side than to be her target. Because I was a coward who cared more about my social status than doing what was right. She met Serafina's eyes directly. You could have hurt us much worse than you did. We all know that now, but you chose not to. That says something about who you are. And who am I? Serafina asked curiously. Someone who's stronger than all of us put together, Brooklyn replied. And I don't just mean physically. They stood in comfortable silence for a while, watching other students pass by. Finally, Brooklyn spoke again. Madison wants to apologize too, but she's too proud to approach you directly. She asked me to tell you that the harassment is over, permanently. And if it's not? Brooklyn shivered slightly. Then she'll find out exactly how much restraint you showed in the library. The following Monday, Serafina arrived at school to find a note slipped into her locker. It was written on expensive stationery in Madison's distinctive handwriting. "I'm sorry. I was wrong about you, and I was wrong about what kind of person I wanted to be. Thank you for not destroying me when you easily could have. I won't bother you again." Serafina folded the note carefully and put it in her pocket. It wasn't forgiveness. Some things couldn't be erased with a simple apology, but it was acknowledgement. Recognition that actions had consequences, and that some people were not as helpless as they appeared. Over the following weeks, Westfield Academy's social dynamics underwent a quiet revolution. The Trinity disbanded, with Cassandra and Brooklyn gravitating toward more positive social circles. Madison kept to herself, focusing on her studies and avoiding the kind of aggressive behavior that had defined her previous reputation. Serafina found herself at the center of a different kind of attention. Students who had been victimized by bullies throughout the school began seeking her out, not just for self-defense lessons, but for advice on how to stand up for themselves. She started an unofficial club that met in an empty classroom after school. She taught them basic techniques for avoiding conflict, de-escalating dangerous situations, and defending themselves when all else failed. But more importantly, she taught them that strength came from within, that they didn't have to accept being victims. "The goal isn't to become a bully yourself," she told them during one of their sessions. "It's to make bullies understand that you're not an easy target. Most of them will move on to someone else if you make it clear that bothering you comes with consequences." Jenny, the freshman who had been one of her first students, raised her hand. "But what if they don't? What if they keep pushing?" Serafina smiled grimly. "Then you push back. Hard enough to make your point, but not so hard that you become what you're fighting against." The club grew from 5 members to 15 to 30. Word spread beyond Westfield's walls, and Serafina began receiving messages from students at other schools who were dealing with similar problems. She realized she had found her calling, not as a covert operative like her parents, but as someone who taught others to stand up for themselves, someone who turned victims into survivors. One evening, as she was packing up after another club meeting, she found Madison waiting for her in the hallway. "I heard about what you're doing," Madison said quietly, "the self-defense club." Serafina nodded warily. Despite the apology note, she wasn't entirely convinced that Madison's change of heart was permanent. "I wanted to ask you something," Madison continued. Would you consider letting me join?" The request was so unexpected that Serafina was momentarily speechless. "You want to join my anti-bullying club?" she asked finally. Madison's face flushed with embarrassment. "I know how it sounds. I know I don't deserve it. But I want to learn. Not just the fighting stuff, but the other things you teach, about being strong without being cruel, about protecting people instead of hurting them." She took a shaky breath. "I spent so much time being afraid that someone would hurt me that I became the person who hurt others first. I don't want to be that person anymore." Serafina studied Madison's face for a long moment. The arrogant queen bee was gone, replaced by someone who looked younger and more vulnerable. "It's not going to be easy," Serafina warned. "Some of the people in that room have very good reasons to hate you." "I know," Madison said. "I'll understand if they don't want me there, but I have to try." Serafina made her decided. "Okay, but you start at the bottom just like everyone else. No special treatment because of who your father is or how much money your family has. I wouldn't want it any other way." Madison did join the club, and her presence initially created exactly the tension Serafina had predicted. But gradually, as she demonstrated genuine remorse and a sincere desire to change, the other students began to accept her. Watching Madison learn to channel her natural leadership abilities in positive directions became one of Serafina's most rewarding experiences. The girl who had once terrorized the school's most vulnerable students became one of their most effective advocates. 6 months after that confrontation in the library, Serafina stood before the entire student body during a school assembly, speaking about conflict resolution and the importance of standing up for others. In the audience, she could see Madison applauding enthusiastically, Brooklyn and Cassandra nodding along with her words, and dozens of students whose lives had been changed by the simple realization that they didn't have to accept being victims. Serafina Blackwood still had secrets. She was still the daughter of 2 of America's most classified operatives. She still possessed skills that could be lethal in the wrong situation. But she was no longer hiding who she was at her core. Someone who protected others, someone who stood up to bullies, someone who believed that strength should be used to lift people up rather than tear them down. As she finished her speech and stepped down from the podium, she caught sight of her reflection in the auditorium's glass doors. Gone was the hunched, invisible girl who had tried so hard to disappear. In her place stood someone confident, purposeful, and unafraid. Not a mouse, after all, she thought with satisfaction. Never was. The applause followed her all the way out of the auditorium, but more important than the recognition was the knowledge that she had found her true strength, not in the ability to hurt others, but in the power to help them discover their own courage. Some secrets were worth keeping, others were worth revealing. And sometimes the most important thing you could do was show the world exactly who you really were.